Are we live? Or rather, am I live? Damn it. The lighting looked good a minute ago. I didn't look like an angry tomato. I look like an angry tomato. How do I fix that? How do I look like an angry tomato? So let me try flicking through this. One that is a little bit less angry tomato. That exacerbates the problem. So that kind of fixes angry tomato. Kinda. All right. Gonna give a few minutes for people to trickle into the comments before I get into the topic. For those of you watching the VOD, howdy, I'm the Shadow of the Hawk. Welcome to the first episode of Hawk Talk, and this is a different topic than what I'd been saying I was going to do. I'd been saying I was going to do why orcs can't build America, and I decided to change it. Why did I decide to change it? A Pilgrim Pass video. As a YouTuber I like to watch, I'll probably post his links down in the description when this stream ends, if I remember to. And he recently posted a video talking about the super soldier. And he raised a point about how if you allow technology to be removed from the hands, or rather technology to allow killing to be taken from human hands, you will see a removal of the necessity of humans. And that got me thinking. That got my brain thinking a little bit, okay? If you transition weaponry, if you transition the ability to kill from the common man, why does that common man matter anymore? Now, obviously, ideas like that have existed for a while. One of the greatest science fiction novels ever, Starship Troopers, is a testament to that. Consistently bringing up ideas of the person's right to choose, the person's right to vote. However, you need to earn that right to vote. And it's really, really interesting to think about. Why do you have societies like Starship Troopers where a person's freedoms are absolute, where every single person has the ability to choose, but then you'll have worlds like, or rather cities, civilizations like Bretonia, which are allowed to oppress their peasantry for the name of a top 1%. Now, obviously, these are fictional factions. You might be going, well, give us some real ones. Feudal Europe. Under feudal Europe, you had a small caste of super elite people who wielded immense amount of power and lived in immense luxury, at least compared to the peasants. Now, yes, kings were not brutal tyrants. They were not as powerful as 20th century dictators, if you actually look at all the different factors they had to control. But kings, priests, merchants, barons, knights, even, you could argue, the soldiers of the medieval period were all of the upper class, of the elite. And the average peasant didn't really get much of a say in how anything was done. If the lord decided, I want to increase a grain tax, the peasant had to pay up, or the knights came in and slaughtered their families. If a merchant decided to increase the price of knives, the merchants guild in charge of manufacturing knives increased the price, you didn't have an alternative. You couldn't go to a different place to acquire knives. Going into, say, the Roman Empire, where much of the land was owned by the aristocracy, and really the only way to achieve any sort of monetary stability was military service or living off the government teat. And in those types of situations, actually, the Senate was not even an elected position. Sure, you had the people's tribunes, but the Senate itself was basically the different nobles jockeying for seats and offering seats to other nobles for support in their own little bullshit. So what societies would we say actually had egalitarianism? Some people might immediately jump to Greece, but Greece is not a good example of that because it is incredibly similar to the European example I gave earlier, because the ability to vote didn't come from your inherentness as a person. It came from the fact that you were a freedman. You owned land. They still had slaves. They still had, or rather, a landowner, not a freedman. They still had slaves. Freedmen couldn't vote because you needed land. And the soldiering class came from predominantly those landowners, even though Greece had a citizen militia. But you're starting to get kind of like closer, you know? If you're a citizen, you can fight, you can equip yourself, and you can go to war. That gives you the authority to vote. You see a very similar thing with the Scandinavian traditions. The Thing, I believe, is the term, where pretty much, at least my understanding of it, correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, pretty much every single man of age was allowed to vote, so long as they were of like a warrior or a merchant or some level of status, they got a vote inherently for being a person within the tribe. And typically, a lot of these tribes, you didn't have one guy bullying you and taking your stuff and your family because you yourself were able to resist and fight back due to a lack of a martial class above you, except for a few specific circumstances. You didn't have Greece or Rome or for the French when the French ran things. And if you actually take a look at human civilization as a whole, the way warfare is waged is a very good indicator of this. When a small number of elite combatants are all you need to win a battle or to wage a war, you see more authoritarian measures. Knights in medieval Europe, for instance, were brutally lethal combatants. A single charge of knights in a good position on the battlefield could rout entire enemy forces. Or a single knight in his plate armor could cut down dozens of unskilled, unequipped peasants. But as warfare shifted away from the value of horsemen, or heavily armored, heavily equipped horsemen, to random people with not guns, crossbows, and bows, you begin to see a level of more egalitarianism. It's not quite what you would see in, say, the United States, where every single person is able to vote, but at the very least, soldiers started having a little bit more value. Again, a very similar thing in the Roman Empire, when Augustus changed up various reforms and offered a lot more wealth from the equestrian class to the legion, you saw this shift of now pretty much anyone can become a legionnaire, anyone can develop the skills to be a martial combatant, and you had an increased population of veterans because of this. Those veterans were given a greater ability to vote. Many of them were put into either positions of power or were able to be added, or basically, they were added to the Senatorum, not Senatorum, that's Warhammer, to the Senate, or they were able to vote in the People's Tribunes, who gained a lot more power because, well, you don't want to piss off the lethally armed, lethally trained people in your civilian population who now also have an immense amount of wealth and are stimulating the economy. So, but even before Rome, let's go back. Macedonia were known for being horsemen. That is part of how they were able to dominate most of the world. And you saw a very structured, very top-down system under Macedonian rule, although that might be affected by other traditions, such as like the Persians or the Egyptians. I'm not as familiar with Macedonian history and culture as I probably should be to be using them as an example. But shifting back away, so after the fall of Rome, after the fall of the citizen soldier, you return to a period of time where you have a lord with a small cadre of elite warriors, and this lord more or less has immense power on the land that he is able to exert violent force upon. Yes, he has to deal with other lords, he has to deal with the church, but as a whole, if it's not an entity of similar or superior power, he has absolute free reign, doesn't need to worry about the peasants, which is more or less what Bretonnia from Warhammer Fantasy is inspired by. Now, yes, it is a much edgier, much more overdone version of this kind of this kind of system, but the tenets stay the same. Only a small number of people are able to exert violent force, and thus they are able to exert it upon a larger population and rule over them with impunity. But as you see the medieval period go on for a longer period of time, technology shifts to allow heavy armor to become something either ubiquitous or near ubiquitous to the point where the average soldier could acquire it, meaning the knight was no longer a brutal, lethal combatant as weapons and armor became more readily available for peasant soldiers, which peasant no longer is a good term for them, because as a guy could pick up a sword and go off to war and come back with large amounts of money and invest and invest and invest, he can uplift his family from just working on a farm to owning a farm, to owning a business, to owning a number of businesses. Warfare breeds the ability to, at least for the winning side, acquire wealth, and they can use that wealth to enhance their own status within their own society, which in turn stimulates the economy, giving them more power and giving people below them the ability to achieve new things. And so you have this cycle of, as weapons technology advances and ousts the knight and the nobles from importance, you start seeing the rise of various merchants. Now, yes, there's a lot more factors involved in there, but this is a thing that happens throughout a lot of periods of history, a lot of regional locations, and it's not just isolated to one or two locations like you might expect something like this to be. As more people become more lethal, those people's opinions matter more. And there is no better example to that than the rise of America. and the French Revolution. See, if you go back to the day and age of Charlemagne, and a bunch of peasants off in fuck all nowhere decided we don't want to pay taxes to our king anymore, he just needs to send a column of armored knights. They go in, they kill the peasants. Now, yes, America did have a great ocean between it and Britain protecting it, but if we still lived in the age of iron and steel, lance and blade, it wouldn't matter. Like, it would just basically be a time difference. You know, instead of that rebellion getting put down in 2 weeks, it would be put down in 6 months because it takes that long to get to the Americas. If the value of martial technology for a person's independence didn't matter, then a force of knights could just trample through the poorly trained, poorly equipped, unprepared forces of the American militias. That's not entirely what you see. You see, yes, the Americans at the beginning are getting trounced and brutally beaten back in traditional combat. Hell, even the guerrilla warfare stage doesn't really work. They're still able to reap a butcher's bill by the nature of firearms being a much easier to use and a much more lethal weapon than a pike or a sword. Crossbows function under a very similar understanding of a gun, albeit on a less destructive and less effective way. And you actually see various legislations within medieval Europe to counter this. I don't remember which pope it was, but there was a pope in, I believe, the 1600s. No, that's too late. Like the 1400s, something like that. Something like towards the end of the medieval period, where the crossbow was banned to be used against other Christians because it gave the average person too much lethal ability against heavily armored soldiers or knights. And you begin to see this in the way that armor develops. By the time of the conquistadors, when you have rifles and cannons and crossbows are much more common, you don't see the heavily armored knight. You see chest protection, head protection, thigh protection, a little bit of arm protection, but it's a lot lighter. It's a lot more maneuverable. The point is you got to be able to maneuver, you got to be able to move, and you got to be able to not be caught in one position and ripped to pieces by enemy rifle and cannon fire. And if weapons technology didn't affect society very, very brutally, very effectively, you wouldn't see those kinds of changes. You would still see Cortez riding at the Aztecs in full plate armor, but that's not what you see because the gun, the cannon, and the crossbow were much more lethal and much more dangerous. And since any man can be trained to use a gun or a crossbow or a cannon in like 6 to 8 weeks, as opposed to becoming a skilled bladesman or a skilled spearman with needing 6 to 8 months at minimum, possibly even more than that, possibly years of your life dedicated to actually being able to not die using one of these weapons. Now you're seeing something a lot more. You're starting to see why egalitarianism begins to take off around the 18th, 19th century. Because back to America, if America had to rely on training swordsmen and spearmen and equipping swordsmen and spearmen with full plate armor, spears, and horses, it would become impossibly expensive to wage a war against Great Britain. But that's not what happens. All you really need is you need uniforms to identify that, hey, this is my side, which you can more or less solve by dyeing your current clothes the color of your faction, and firearms, which at the time of the Revolution were ubiquitous. People used them for hunting. People used them for defending their homestead. People used them like people still have them from when they served in the British military when they were pacifying the French and the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples or the initial colonizers. Or do you want me to go by specific tribes? Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Huron, Cherokee. I'm just going to call them Native Americans because that's simpler. So you have firearms are ubiquitous. It's just you don't have people who really necessarily know how to use them in formation, how to stand there and take a bullet to the chest, how to know when to commit, what terrain to use. And that's when the French came in. The French came in, they educated the American population, and in a very, very small amount of time compared to the medieval period, you had effectively untrained farmers, untrained militiamen turn into lethally effective combatants capable of waging warfare against British soldiers on open fields, as opposed to basically waiting for them to come to your town, shooting them from the rafters, and fucking running for the hills and hoping you don't get shot. That is a gross oversimplification of the American Revolutionary War. It is a lot more complicated than that, but for the purposes of this discussion, let's just say that's what happened and move on. The French Revolution is another good example for an inverse reason. The French nobles continued their tyrannical reign of taxing the peasant, ignoring the peasant. There was a system, there's kind of an egalitarian system of each of the classes basically getting to appoint a representative, and that representative speaking for them and getting a vote on policy. But it was basically, you had the super upper class, like the billionaires, you had the millionaires, and then you had everyone else. And the billionaires and millionaires would pretty much vote together, leaving the peasants and the low class to deal with it. So if, hey, we need to raise money to pay off our war debts, okay, are we, the billionaires, going to have to do it? No. Hey, millionaires, do you want to have to do it? No, we're good. Okay, so I don't want to pay it. You don't want to pay it. Let's just make the peasants pay it. Because the millionaires and the billionaires seemingly wielded a lot more power. And up until the revolution, they did. They had more wealth, they had more soldiers, they had more influence, they had more political acumen, they had more connections, they had everything you needed. And yet the peasants got tired. They stormed the Bastille, they seized firearms, and they used said firearms to overthrow the reigning monarchy, to take and pillage and despoil and establish, well, they slaughtered each other for a bit. They had a bit of a dictator for a period of time, but eventually they settled out and had egalitarianism, where every single person, because, you know, a guy with a gun is as lethal as another guy with a gun, every voice was considered. And this is the trend that you begin to see throughout Europe, throughout America, throughout like a lot of different locations. You start to see the value of the individual become more pronounced. Yes, you still have parts of the world where you have princes and kings and warlords and tyrants, but take a look at a lot of those locations. Like, look at Africa, where you still have warlords. Guns are not something you can just go to your local Walmart and get. They are very specific, specialized equipment that you need to spend a large amount of money to acquire. Ammunition is expensive. Maintenance is expensive. And you are constantly in a war zone, meaning you are constantly needing new firearms. You're constantly needing new ammunition. You're constantly needing new professionals to maintain and repair and acquire your weaponry for you. That is why at this current, they are a rare item. They are like when firearms were first introduced into Europe. So which is why you still have warlords. But as time is going on, you're starting to see more egalitarian societies form in regions that are more prone to, and apologies for the use of the term here, but civilizing. Why do I say civilizing? Well, because when you go from anarchy state of slaughter, death, murder, kill, which gross oversimplification of Africa as a whole, but specific regions that does apply to them, to we have cities, we have an organized government, we have infrastructure, we have police, we have firefighters, we have law enforcement, we have a judicial system, we provide civic services for our population, we have businesses that aren't fearful of being taken over by warlords, children are allowed to sleep without having to fear being turned into child soldiers. That is civilization. And what do you see? You see a lot of African nations have a form of egalitarianism. Maybe it's not as perfect as what the American system likes to pretend it is, but as these populations get more access to the ability to drive off these warlords who wield monopolies of violence, and every single person is just as lethally dangerous because of firearms, or because they're trying to buddy up to other egalitarian systems that can, you know, exert brutal violence to make them egalitarian, they become egalitarian. Because at the end of the day, no human wants to serve someone who's above them, someone who's superior to them. They want to choose their own destiny. But you can't really do that in a world where there's a big, strong guy who wants to beat the crap out of you. But if you have a gun and the other guy's got a gun, it doesn't matter that he's bigger and stronger than you, because you both are lethally dangerous. And you might want to work together to kill third guy who's got some guys who also have guns. Where am I going with that? Why? This is turning into a bit of a ramble. Okay, back to the overall point. Militarism nurtures democracy. I mean, okay, I use the term democracy. It's more egalitarianism. I'm just trying to. It's a very buzzwordy title. It's a very clickbaity title. Fuck. Where was I going with that? Okay. Egalitarianism, militarism. See, I had a point I was going to go to. I really did. And I forgot it. All right. I thought that was honestly going to have a longer conversation. And yeah, I thought I'd have more. I guess I probably should have. You know what? Let's hold on. Let me just quickly Because I ran out of the militarism angle, let's shift it to why orcs cannot make America. Because, I mean, we've only been streaming for like 30 minutes, and I don't want to make a 30-minute stream. I at least want an hour-long stream. So let's talk about why orcs can't make America. But what are orcs? I mean, yeah, you can point to Lord of the Rings, you can point to Warhammer, you can point to Warcraft, as those are orcs. But what makes an orc as opposed to an elf or a dwarf or a Goliath or a human? Let's think. Well, some traits of orcs are that they are super duper duper strong. They are able to swing a weapon and break a man's bones sheerly through the force of the blow. We also know that orcs are incredibly tough. Warhammer orcs, whether it be 40k or fantasy, can have limbs removed, head removed, and sewn back together, and they will work fine. Lord of the Rings orcs, they can take stab wounds, arrow wounds, broken bones, and they can keep going. And as you see in the Shadow of War game, which I will expand upon that sooner, for all you people who don't think it's canon, hear me out on just this point. It's described how Uruks, the only way to confirm a kill on an Uruk is to cut their head off. And even at that point, you can encounter Uruks that stitch their heads back on. Now, some of you might be going, that game's not canon, that game's not canon, that game's not canon. Blah, blah, blah. Let me explain why I'm willing to take its point about Uruks. Orcs, goblins, whatever you want to say, are based, originally were elves. The species of orc, the race of orc, the kind of orc was elven. And then Morgoth came in and corrupted them and turned them into what we know them now. Now, yeah, they're corrupted, but why would that make them into these sniveling, pathetic creatures that we see them as in Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit? Some of you might be going, well, as darkness consumed them, it made them weaker. But if darkness inherently makes you weak, then why is Sauron so powerful? Why was Morgoth so powerful? Why were the dragons and the Balrogs so powerful? So I think the reasoning behind why the orcs, as seen in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, are so weak is because the conditions they live in are not very good. They consume maggoty bread. They live in large populations in horrible squalor, confined in dark spaces because of their fear of the sun. And again, there's way too fucking many of them. There's armies and armies and armies being made every single day. That's going to put a strain on their logistics. Rations are going to have to be cut and cut and cut, or it's going to have to be even poorer quality rations, which will also be cut and cut and cut to the point where they're malnourished, they're tired, they're locked in eternal disease, they're probably not being given good medical care, they're being trained horribly, but trained brutally to the point where they're breaking bones, they're getting lacerations that get infected, etc., etc., etc. And that leaves them as physically weaker and more pathetic than the orcs as they are in their natural state. If you look at Shadow of War, there are very few orcs in comparison to the movies of The Hobbit. They live in open areas. They have access to grazing grounds, and we see that they have large amounts of meat that they are storing within nets over their little encampments. So you can assume that at some point between Shadow of War and Lord of the Rings, that these orcs are going to become, the orcs that we know, because there will be too many orcs, meaning they won't have this surplus of food. They won't have as much space as they have. They, for whatever reason, the darknet, they become more susceptible to the light. I can't really explain that one from Shadow of War, but that will drive them underground, meaning they will need more cramped space, which is why the goblins of Moria and the goblins of the Misty Mountains are goblins and not proper orcs. They're in enclosed cavernous spaces, and they're eating very, very poor nutritional diets, making them smaller, weaker, more pathetic. And if you look at the Hobbit film, which, again, no one really wants to take a look at the Hobbit film, but if you compare those orcs, the orcs of Angmar, to the goblins of the Misty Mountains, the orcs of Angmar Gundabad can be presumably, they're up in the north. The days are going to be shorter. There's more time outside. They can be out hunting meat. They can be roaming the open fields, the open Arctic wastes. And that will grant them, it won't be good conditions. They won't be fat and plump, but they'll be big and strong. And what do we see? The orcs of Gundabad are bigger and stronger, as depicted in the film The Hobbit. And there's a decent amount of evidence that from the appendices that the orcs of Gundabad would also be bigger and stronger because they resisted the dwarves pretty effectively. And also, Gundabad would be the last bastion of orcs from the age of when Morgoth of Melkor walked the earth. when these would be the direct descendants of the armies he wielded, which would have been the populations that are freshly corrupted from being elven. And if that is their natural environment, then that would make sense that the orcs of Angmar would naturally be bigger and stronger. And again, we see that kind of in the Hobbit film, which is, people aren't going to like this, but it is the only real depiction of the battle of the five armies that we have. So it doesn't directly counter, the actual fight doesn't directly counter anything Tolkien wrote. Details of it, yes, but the idea of a martial, larger population of orcs isn't in direct conflict, especially since good to bad is, scary and a threat. So all of that is the case, all of that. So orcs are bigger, stronger, tougher than humans. What else? They are an allegory for the hinterland barbarian. A lot of people are going to be mad at me going, Shadow, why are you talking about allegories? Why are you bringing up, are you saying that orcs are black people? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying orcs they're the Gauls. They're the Germanics. They're the Mongols. They're the, what's another one? They're the Celts. They are the Berbers. They're the Turks. They are, what's a good African example? They are the Comanche. Like, these are the people on the fringe of society that live out in the place that you don't really want to live, that I don't want to live, but they live there, and it makes them bigger, it makes them stronger, it makes them more violent than the city-dwelling, grain-eating populations. And so when they come down as raiders, brutally dangerous raiders. And that's what you see most of the time with orcs. They live on the fringes, they live out in the deserts, they live up in the mountains, they live in the Badlands, they live in the hills. And when they come out of nowhere, they come out as a screaming thunderstorm of violence, slaughtering and killing and breaking everything. They force themselves onto the local population's women, and thus half-orcs are born. A mixture of orcish and whatever culture they're born to. If you look at how barbarians have functioned in human history, you see something very similar. Barbarians come down from wherever they were, they conquer the place that they decided to take over, and that results in a mixing of their cultures. Because typically the barbarians see that, hey, it's nice to live in a city if I'm on top. But they like to keep their martial traditions, their tradition of horsemanship, of swordsmanship, of weapons crafting, of their attire. But at the same time, they'll take on the luxuries of the place they've conquered. And you see a mixing, just like you see a mixing with half-orcs. If a half-orc is born to a human woman, she's going to try to raise that child as best she can to be within her culture, but there's still going to be the orcish drive to be a warrior, to be violent, to genocide elves, because, well, in the case of D&D. And, yeah, that's what's you're going to see that happen. So orcs they're tougher, bigger, and stronger. They are the hinterland barbarians. They're also carnivorous. Pretty much every depiction of orcs will blatantly show them eating meat, but not really vegetables, and not really grains. And I feel like that would make sense with their temperament. They are hyper-evolved apex predators. They come out, they slaughter, they kill, they eat. Why do I need to point that out? I'll explain later. Finally, orcs rarely, if ever, form proper kingdoms. They never ascend to building castles and fortresses and organized systems of law and merchant societies. Why? Because of all those different factors. They're carnivores. They are hinterland barbarians. They are violent. They are destructive. All of these things coalesce into a population that cannot and never will ascend to civilization. Predominantly because, according to this book, civilization requires farming. You need centralization. You need bureaucracy. And that doesn't come from hunter-gatherers. It doesn't come from... You could sort of get it from ranchers, but ranchers also have farms. They have to... A rancher cannot solely subsist off the meat from their animals. They must also have access to grain, corn, potatoes, squash, etc., etc. Orcs don't have that. They have their herd. They would have their herds of cattle if they're not, just taking other people's food. But that wouldn't be enough to supply a large population, maybe a couple hundred, maybe even a couple thousand orcs. But you can't build a civilization on a couple hundred or a couple thousand individuals. You need tens of thousands. You need millions of people to build a civilization. So because the orcs are not able to sow, they're not able to they're not able to build fields, they're not able to grow crops, that is going to result in them developing a civilization that cannot get past the effectively tribal stage. Sure, they'll construct buildings, they might even construct walls, but they'll never have enough food to support a population big enough to have large numbers of specializations. Sure, they might see humans and elves and dwarves do blacksmiths, so they might have blacksmiths because they see humans, elves, and dwarves making metal tools, but they will never figure that out on their own. They might have priests, and those priests might get a little bit of extra food and might distribute the food to who they see fit, but you will never see an organized religion like you see with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, etc., because there's no real infrastructure, no real drive to write it down, because you will just speak it to your subordinate, you will speak it to the masses. There's not enough territory where you need to write it down for any reason. They will forever be stuck as primitive barbarians. Also, they're not really going to absorb much culture, because rarely, if ever, are orcs shown to be tolerant of the people that they raid. They'll burn your city down. They might take the stuff that they can incorporate into their culture, such as your weapons, your armor, your women, maybe your children as slaves, but they won't take your art. They won't take your knowledge, your magic, your history. They will just destroy it all. So that segues into America. What is America? America is 50 war states in a trench coat with a defense budget big enough to fight God or die trying. It is also a lot more complicated than that. America founded not when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, not when the first British colonists settled in North America, not when Jamestown supplicated to the whims of the Powhatan Confederacy, not when the Puritans began killing their own young women because they thought they were witches. America was born in 1776 by the Declaration of Independence. America is a conglomeration of outsiders, of refugees, not refugees. America is a conglomeration of outsiders. It is the people who were fourth sons, who were religious outcasts, who couldn't exist within Britain, Ireland, or Scotland, and left. And they came to the New World, and they built a life for themselves. And the crown pushed and pushed and pushed, and the Americans broke through. And ever since those days, America has hated the idea of a tyrant, of a king, of authoritarianism. I mean, we almost let George Washington be a king, but we decided against it. Then America expanded westward. The success of the American experiment brought Germans, it brought French, it brought Polish, Italians, Spaniards. Not as many Spaniards because they had their own colonies, but as we pushed and pushed and pushed, we brought new people here. And those people settled, and they expanded the borders of America as more land was required. Native Americans were either incorporated into the American society, or they were pushed out. Freed Africans, and freed Irish were either incorporated or they were pushed out, and then eventually resubsumed by the United States. And as we pushed and pushed and pushed, and we reached the West Coast, we started bringing in the Chinese, the Japanese, and they started adding their own collective ideals and their own collective beliefs as they helped build this nation up. America is a nation of outsiders. It is a nation of outcasts. It is a nation of uniqueness. It is 1,000 different ideas being crammed into a small space and given a chance to grow and become what it is today. It is also a horribly violent civilization. It is a horribly violent population. It has only ever known 13 years of peace. Why? Because we were fighting against potential tyrannies. We were fighting against the hinterland barbarians, these are Mexicans. I'm talking about the American-Mexican War of, I think, 1850. I think that's when we fought it, 1840s, 1850s, something like that. We were fighting against bush wars against Native American tribes, such as the Blackfoots, the Comanche, the Apache. As we finally developed ourselves as an existing power, we started waging wars of political interest. World War I was the first big example of a war of political interest, not something we were just gaining territory, but something of, hey, we need to affect ourselves on the world stage, when we fought against Germany. But that itself was also not a very popular decision because most Americans were German at the time. We had a more cultural connection to Germany than we did Britain. And then the rise of Nazism happened. And despite most of what the Nazis preached coming from American thinkers, we fought them because we had this idea of every man has the right to exist. Every man has the right to pursue his own happiness. And we slaughtered the Germans, the Italians, the Berbers, the Barbary Coasters, the Japanese. We slaughtered them because they seemed to believe differently than us. Then we would go into the Middle East, we would go into Africa, we would go into Asia to force these ideas of freedom, of independence onto these people. Why am I giving this hyper like America first, America amazing? Because at its core, America is founded on the idea of the individual. You don't, as long as you come to America, you learn English, you learn our laws, you kind of pick up a love of football and being fat. You're an American. You can still keep your holidays from where you came from. We'll take it as an excuse to get off work, to get out of school if you bring it with you. But if you come to America, you are not required to convert from whatever religion you are. You are not required to abandon whatever food you ate, your choice of dress, so long as it's not too provocative. You are allowed to continue being you. And when you are in America, you can develop who you are, what that means. You are not locked in what your parents were. For example, let's say your parents were coal miners. You are not trapped in the position of being a coal miner. You have every opportunity available to you. There is no systemic reason why you cannot rise up from being a coal miner and be a doctor, a lawyer, a soldier. But if you go to certain countries, either in the rest of the world or if you go back in time far enough, the only opportunities available to you are what your family can directly touch upon. If your family are coal miners, maybe you can uplift yourself to a supervisor or a blacksmith because your family has direct connection with those. But you may never be a soldier. A soldier, that's complicated. But you would never be a doctor. You would never be a lawyer. You would never be a teacher. You would be stuck within whatever your mining town can provide. And yes, that is partly the result of globalism, of a more rapid connectiveness of human society. But take even in, say, China. Under China, there are systemic rules that basically lock you in place to what you are if you wish to remain within the bounds of society. You effectively cannot leave your own town if you don't want to be a criminal. Meaning, if you want to go be a doctor, but your town doesn't allow for people to be doctors, you're up shit creek without a paddle. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that is the gist of it, basically. Or if you're in, say, an African nation where you are constantly, or not all African nations, very specific African nations that are racked by brutal, divisive warfare due to various warlords taking power, you are what you are by the whims of these warlords. If they decide that you are allowed to continue being a farmer or a herder, you are a farmer or a herder. If they decide that you are now a soldier, you are a soldier. If they decide you are a medic, you are a medic. Your life is at the whims of this person who has the power to end it. But in America and in the places that we have touched or turned into colonies, and yes, if you look to America to protect you, if you look to America to define your political system, if you look to America for the shows or movies you watch, you're an American colony. Fuck you, Brits. We Uno reversed you. You're our colony now. But you see these people trying to emulate what America is, being a nation of outsiders that allow for every individual's opinion to be considered. It doesn't necessarily matter on the grand scheme of things, but at the end of the day, you are allowed to pursue the life you wish to pursue. Orcs are incapable of producing that. Not only is their mindset of genocide and warfare incapable of wrapping the idea around accepting other ideas, but they simply do not possess the technology to develop what America is further. Because America is not just a place of idea, it is not a place of individuality, it is not a place of the outsider, it is also the greatest military to ever exist due to its overuse of naval and air power. And yes, America is the greatest military power to ever exist when it has the first and second largest air forces, the first and second largest navies, when its army, when its military has very rarely, if ever, actually retreated. And no, I don't mean pulling out of a zone that we have no more interest in being in. I mean actually deciding, hey, we're losing this fight. Let's pull out of this fight. Let's leave this fight. Even in Afghanistan, even in the place that we so-called lost, how many battles were losses for America? Vietnam, how many battles were losses for America? How many people did we actually lose in those warfare compared to how many people we killed? Look at pretty much every war that America has ever been a part of, aside from 1812, but we still win that because New Orleans. America is a society that is built around having a very badass and a very effective military that can kill literally everything else around us. Because when we leave Fortress de Americana, when we leave our continent, we don't do so to die. We don't do so by choice of, we don't want to die. We don't leave our island fortress to die. We leave to make you die. Orcs would be incapable of this, simply put, because of a lack of technological diversity. Each and every warband, each and every warlord would basically do things how he wants and how he understands. There would never be an understanding of combined arms. And that warlord might go, I like horses, and figure out how to use horses. Or another warlord might go, I like bows, and use bows. But you would never really see a joining of the horse, the bow, the spear. And why am I describing as best Air Force, best Navy, and talking about this? Because modern day warfare is effectively medieval warfare. It's just on a larger scale. The Air Force and the Navy are cavalry. The soldiers, such as the Marines and the Army, those are your line infantry. It's even in the terminology we use, with the Air Force sometimes being referred to as the air cavalry. One sec, I need to drink some water. The air cavalry. It is a compartmentalization. It is a specialization of warfare. Orcs are pretty much, being hinterland barbarians, are very incapable of that. They do not possess the infrastructure to maintain knowledge of warfare, to specialize knowledge of warfare. And they lack the drive or the ability to properly unify. Sure, you might have an Orcus Khan, basically just Genghis Khan, but with tusks, rally a bunch of orcs together to wage a war. But it's basically just going to be with him. After he dies, his sons are probably going to be ingrates who can't really do anything. And even then, what is he really going to do besides get them all together and tell them how to effectively kill stuff with their forces? There's not going to be any innovation. It's just going to be using what you already have. Whereas America has always innovated, has always developed, has always changed the scope of warfare, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst, in order to achieve victory. It is in the American combat doctrine to be able to win a two-front war on opposite ends of the world so that we will never have to worry about World War II being the kind of problem that we have to worry about. Orcs are incapable of that level of thinking because they can never develop that kind of military force. A stable, massive army is reliant on having a stable and centralized society. Rome did not defeat the rest of Europe due to a technological advantage. Rome defeated the rest of Europe because it had centralized bureaucracy capable of raising large numbers of soldiers, which also describes America, a centralized bureaucracy capable of raising large numbers of soldiers. So between a lack of technological development, a lack of potential for innovation due to small numbers and lack of centralization, and a intolerance of all other ideas, you would never see orcs make America. Hell, humans probably would have failed to make America if it wasn't for a few random bullshit things happening. If you didn't have the New World, you never would have saw America. There would never have been a clean slate. There would have always just been a new king and a new king and a new king and a new king. And a new king and a new king and on and on and on. It goes. Trapped in the medieval period for all of eternity. Anyway. Yeah, that's basically it. I was hoping there'd be some people in the chat by now to be asking questions or asking me to elaborate, to expand upon some things that I probably overlooked. That doesn't happen. That doesn't seem to be going on. So, yeah, this has been episode 1 of Hawk Talk. Not as long as I was hoping, not as chat-based as I was hoping, but, it was rambly. It was fun. I'll try to do another one of these next week, probably on a better topic, one that doesn't rely so much on people asking questions or me remembering every single thing that I was thinking about throughout the week beforehand. Anyway, to the one person who's watching right now, thank you for tuning in. Oh, hey, Zenny. It's Zenny. Oh, hey, Zenny. You got any questions for my rambling? Just to try to pad the time count. Any questions at all? Need me to explain anything? Day going good. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'll give Zenny a few seconds to type, and if she's got no questions, then I'll just end the stream. Yeah, I'm taking the lack of comment as a lack of questions. So I'm going to go through the spiel again. Thank you all for watching. Have a good day. Thank you again, Zenny, for tuning in. You're a real one. Have a good. Oh, yeah, you're good. Okay, Zenny's good. Yeah. Thank you for putting up with my rambling, Zenny. Have a good one, everyone. To the people watching the VOD. See you.